So we'll start our last panel of the day of this wonderful, fascinating, a little depressing conference. I thank you so much for holding up the whole day for this last panel, which is called Contested Futures, Illiberal Populisms, Politics of Threat. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our chair for tonight, Amy Krauss, who is a visiting assistant professor in anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She received her doctorate from Johns Hopkins University and actually just finished her fellowship here at the Posen Center for Human, not just, but a few months back at the Posen Center for Human Rights. Amy is a cultural anthropologist whose research and teaching interests span questions of law, inequality and state making, decolonial feminist studies of science, technology, and medicine, embodiment and reproductive ethics and politics. Her ethnographic inquiries and writing are grounded in participatory action research with feminist activists, community organizers, and healthcare practitioners in Mexico, Latin America, and the US. And she's currently working on a book project called Counterpoint of Care, Abortion Law and Feminist World-Making, So, Amy, the floor is yours.
I'm very happy to be part of this conference, and I'd like to begin by introducing Srimati Basu. She's professor of gender and women's studies and anthropology, a member of the Committee on Social Theory at the University of Kentucky. She holds an interdisciplinary PhD from Ohio State University in cultural studies, anthropology, and women's studies. Her teaching, research, and community work address global feminisms, law, gender-based violence, social movements, feminist methodologies, and masculinities. At present, she's writing a monograph on anti-feminist men's rights groups, drawing upon fieldwork conducted as part of a 2013-14 Fulbright Fellowship. She will also conduct research on Indian women private investigators with grants from a National Endowment for Humanities and the American Institute of Indian Studies Fellowship. She is the president-elect of the Association for Feminist Anthropology, and she's also participated in the UN expert group meeting titled Family Policy Development, Achievements and Challenges. Her publications address topics ranging from the legacies of feminist reforms in India to marriage and conjugality, property, law, violence, and popular culture. Her work has appeared in a wide range of journals, including Feminist Anthropology, Signs, a Journal of LGBTQ Worldmaking, International Feminist Journal of Politics, as well as popular publications in Ms. Magazine and India Today. The title of her paper is Asserting Vulnerability as Anti-Gender Politics, Indian Anti-Feminist Men's Rights Activist Claims to Gendered Harm.
Thank you, Amy. I noticed I wrote that in some time ago. So I did do some of the field work on women detectives, and I am now the president of the Association for Feminist Anthropology. Please come, those of you who are anthropologists, please come join and do. We have many tasks opening up. I'll make a plug. And thank you, Roy and Michelle, for such a good, stimulating conversation. Amy just very nicely teed up the thing I was going to talk about, which is that in 2013-14, and in smaller bouts since then, I've conducted ethnographic fieldwork with men's rights activists or MRA groups. I should say, Misha and Roy urged us to do access copies, so there is a lot of explaining the pictures, but I enjoyed the process. So I looked at this emergent men's rights groups in a number of Indian cities, including interviews with movement leaders and other members. I attended weekly meetings and public events and looked at documentation and media material, of which there is a lot. I had thought that from media accounts that I would be encountering a few kind of custodially deprived fathers and controlling husbands. But I actually discovered that every time I went to a meeting, there would be kind of hundreds of people showing up at meetings across the country around, and that had to do at that moment with a change in the laws of marriage and property. So some people became, got drawn into the movement, became leaders, became rank and file. Others left occasionally and went. So I tried to look at the panoply of things. One of the things I wanted to talk with you about is to think about what kind of movement this is, right? So to go back to the word genre, I don't know that it is it certainly uses discourses of what men and what women should be like, right? But it's all, some parts of the movement also don't go into men must be leaders of the family type of idea. Some of them are more, consider themselves more hip, for want of a better word. And there's plenty of work on Hindutva in India and its relationship to masculinity. So this is not, I think their principal challenge is not the political system with which they insert themselves in different ways, but their principal challenge, back to genre, is with other men's groups in, for example, the research in the United Kingdom or Australia, who are men's rights groups who have gathered around questions of divorce, custody, etc. So this movement dates from the early 1990s. Those of you who saw my longer paper will see some of the documents from there. So in the 80s, there were significant changes to rape law, divorce law, new family codes, etc. And this seems to have arisen in response to that. And it picked up a lot of steam in 2005 when the domestic protection, and never mind. I've written down this a shorter title, when the Domestic Violence Act was passed. So the MRM, the Men's Rights Movement, gathered under the banner organization called Save Indian Family Foundation, SIF, which describes itself as specializing in, quote, problems of men, just the way aeronautical engineers specialize in building aircrafts, countering, they say, treacherously anti-male society and protecting, quote, the civil liberties of hundreds of thousands of people in India, which are violated as they are detained or jailed in false dowry cases by the Indian government. I won't go into that. There's a lot of stuff on how there's a sort of a technique of using criminal and civil laws simultaneously, which they principally object to. So they initially began as a Yahoo group and then have gone on to do face-to-face things, starting a center, etc. So tell me how I'm doing, or you can do it. So here are some of the, I think I lost the top. These are the names of some of the organizations that mushroomed in cities. You'll see that the group's names prominently foreground rights discourse, speaking in the name of persecuted husbands and on behalf of the notion of family and children, right? So that at the bottom, you'll see the names of the women's groups, Forgotten Women's Association, Mothers and Sisters Initiative, Masi, which is a word for aunt in several Indian languages. And so the women's groups are for, they say, the vast numbers of women who are accused and jailed in the name of women's rights. So that they say sisters-in-law and mothers-in-law are jailed because wives complain. So for most of this is all I'm going to say by way of background, because today I want to talk mostly about a chapter I'm working on, which I'm tentatively calling something like Embodied Vulnerability, Loneliness, Health, and Violence, which focuses on the brave, wounded, vulnerable, and abject male body that is at the core of claims made by the Indian men's rights movement. So take the mustache, which simultaneously, I think we can go to the next one, simultaneously indexes male power, not that growing a mustache requires any particular talent. So it simultaneously indexes male power, vanity in masculine performance, and also claims to gender neglect, right? You'll see it's connected to various diseases. So this is a movie star, 2014, Farhan Akhtar, he was nominated as the UN Women goodwill ambassador for this organization called MARD, which is Men Against Rape and Discrimination. Sorry, the bottom is cut off. And the acronym also means man, again, in several Indian languages. So he grows his feminist mustache, right? He famously distributed once 70,000 mustaches to a whole stadium full of people at an IPL match. On the other hand, do you mind trying? This big thing? Yeah, it's the button that's faded. Oh. Which way am I pointing it? Or it might be just simpler. I'll just gesture it. So Farhan Akhtar grew his feminist mustache. These men grew their anti-feminist mustaches. Say they aligned with the global communities of men's rights, right? So I should say that all these men's organizations that across November grow their mustaches consist of like 3 different kinds of people, right? One, organizations that foreground crises of men's well-being spanning, dealing with men's health. Second, those which use men's health problems to inscribe men as a whole as the most, ignored and deserving candidates of aid and attention on a variety of socio-legal fronts. So the International Men's Day page, I would say, is an example of that. And third, overtly misogynist organizations, right? So I'm interested in the movement between those two. So the next one. So an exemplar is this group called Movember, November with an M. So Mo's for Bros, the campaign is called. Originally targeted at an awareness of prostate cancer in Australia, now a global event, including other men's health issues, such as testicular cancer, depression, etc. So the most recent fundraising in June 22, they're very hip. So they're like trying to sell NFTs for Mo's. They talk about the metaverse, your Mo will help open up the first men's health facility in the metaverse, right? And people who've studied Movember point out that the group is they're very active, but they're mostly involved in talking about how the mustache growing is going and how to recruit new people, so the discussions of health more fall away, but it's kind of important as a form of community, right? So these tropes and tactics allow us to consider a core irony at the heart of men's movements. MRAs are inscribed as dominant and potentially violent, associated with global alt-right groups. So they're a kind of classic hegemonic masculinity, to use Connell's term. MRM discourses often align with patriarchal privilege, familial and economic power. But the Indian movement, to take one example, cultivates strategic disempowerment, emphasizing frailty and abandonment as a means to re-secure power. They frame their causes within the language of human rights and gender equity, identified as the dominant discourse of inclusion and hence of recognition of our times. On the one hand, affective registers of vulnerable masculinity help the Indian MRM frame their stance through rights discourses in realms of law and policy. On the other hand, its actions and rhetoric are deeply imbued with ideas of men's superior entitlements. There is also the question of whose identity comes to represent vulnerability, right? So in this chapter, I'm going to look at some of the ways that the evocation of the sorry plight of poor or abandoned men accrues advantages for those within the movement who might not be disadvantaged economically or socially. So the MRM depicts itself as struggling to find joy and community, members hassled by legal runarounds, bleeding out money and alimony, they say, and encountering suspicion and distaste at every turn. They make this explicit, for example, by spurning sugar in their tea and coffee at their annual meeting, to emphasize that their lives have no sweetness. If you have had Indian tea, you will know how big a sacrifice that is, right? So they observe International Women's Day as a day of mourning, right? I won't go into all this, but Lakshman, who from the Ramayana epic, who's visualized as a really baby brother to the hero. They think of him as their mascot, they say, because he spent 14 years in the forest by himself, right? I could go on about that. So these emotional registers are leitmotifs in the public actions of the movement, known for its performative flair. So various people cite them as examples of a really kind of a movement that has kind of spectacular actions, right? So if you would go forward. So they had a 2014 Gamcha rally in Kolkata. One more on November. This is the Gamcha rally. I couldn't find pictures of the Gamcha rally, but this is an example for you of what the Gamcha looks like. It's kind of become very couture at the moment. So here, the Gamcha is this thin, highly absorbent checked cotton fabric in common use as a towel in Indian households, is used to connote impoverishment, according to them, brought on by legal costs and alimony payments, here in the context of a bill instituting matrimonial property. This is all we have left with, as one leader described it. While this rally used Gamcha fabric to suggest poverty, another rally I often heard about from December 2014 used saris as their fabric of choice. Here you go. So could we like look at the top maybe? So Hriday's members donned saris, believing that since a man's voice is never heard, they had to turn into women, right? So here, strategic feminization, or turning into women, becomes embodied accusation. The sari is a symbol of their emasculation and powerlessness, and contrarily, a symbol of the power of feminists over them, right? Conflated with women's power. And this movement then also draws upon a longer social movement history of sari wearing by men. You could see the next image, where saris on male bodies are inscribed as feminization, powerlessness, and hence emasculation perpetrated by the government. So this is from the farmers' protest, right? Where they both say the government has turned us into women, but they also say we need protection. We and our women need protection. So these performances draw on the broader lament that vulnerability should be a necessary component of masculine being. So just two quick examples by text. I won't read them out to you. This one is from the president of one of the organizations, the main branch of Kolkata, which puts harms of gender roles at the heart of the problem. And in the second, sorry, there's a lot to read. MRA Vibhas regards girlhood with envy, going back to something we said earlier, as freedom and healthy mental development. The prison of patriarchy is seen to disproportionately repress boys and simultaneously ask too much of them. Notably, such laments represent gender roles as the main source of disadvantage for men. Any structural gender disparities of resources or privilege, like property ownership, education, labor market disparities, mobility, do not figure in such equations. So in this chapter, I'll only give you a couple examples of it. I present a reading of a touring exhibition put on by SIFF for International Men's Day for a fuller picture of the way this discourse is deployed. The show consists of a series of sketches, memes, and photographs. Most sourced, most sourced from the internet, put together to provide a consolidated archive of their positions. So, and one live action figure, who we will see him, the Superman dad, whether in person or in photographed form, he's a crucial figure for this recasting of masculinities traced in this chapter. So this tubby man whose costume evokes pity and pathos, right? The image is playful and sad, portraying a caring father who has to petition for his rights to father, in contrast to the patriarchal, paterfamilias figure. So, people often laugh at this image, but I think he's, because his embodiment can't match up to the impossible body of Superman, like who can? But he's purposefully inhabiting the ridiculous in the currency of engaging children's attention. Right? There are other images like that. So the fatherhood signaled here indicates a new register of paternal custody and involvement that must be fought for and won in line with similar movements around the world. And again, a change from what men's and fathers' rights used to be, let's say, 100 years ago. Notably, it emphasizes affective fatherhood and eludes questions of the materialities of child rearing in terms of labor, time, or resources. So behind him, you can't see that very well, he's photographed in front of 3 other images of other unnamed people who are imagined to represent various aspects of war, right? So as interpreted for me, first, a male beggar described as abandoned by his family. The caption is, should we have a men's welfare ministry, for the first one. Second, a mime who is performing as a hermit or a beggar. Caption, a mute statue is what men are when it comes to handling emotional turmoil. And third, supposedly an Argentinian gaucho, Hawai, kicking up dust, right? Captioned, if cornered, men can give a damn to anything, signifying the self-destructive quality of macho ideology. If the first 2 represent impoverishment and abandonment, the latter is supposed to indicate both the toxic anger of hegemonic masculinity and the incipient logic of its violence. So note the ways that the curation imagines family abandonment as the beggar's plight and blames women's selfish grasp over development resources as the cause, right? The performance in the second, similarly, is interpolated through the narrative of mute stoicism. So the art of miming is transformed into oppressive silencing. Rohit, who I interviewed, explained that gaucho image by drawing a connection to MRAs who now refuse to get married. These are the MG Taos, because of how laws are unfairly used against them, meaning they choose social chaos out of anger and frustration. So in other words, the images are juxtaposed and interpreted against their grain, right? To highlight masculinity in terms of harms to men, gender roles as destructive to men, and of the distress to men produced by political economy. So the display relies heavily on cumulative visual affect along these 6 themes. So with some exceptions in the last 2 categories, these images of men have no necessary connection. The ones I showed you or the ones in the exhibition have no necessary connections to men's rights activists, but they stand kind of as the whole, right? Indian masculinity that represents the part, sort of reverse metonymy, the part being the plight of men in the MRM. A couple of examples to show you how the curating language directs us to understand the images of work and respite in ways that are consonant with the movement's claims, such as by imposing thanklessness or lonesomeness. So here, caption, a man burdened with responsibilities, right? So a literal heavy load is cast as a burden of responsibility. Second, a sitting man is deemed to be literally grounded in reality, right? Echoing the common sense that MRAs claim for themselves. Third, a person with a duffel bag becomes someone who has only those possessions, mirroring the reduced circumstances of MRMs. And finally, a man sleeping on break becomes associated with discarded and thrown out husbands. Sorry, you have to read the captions together. So a different framing of these same images could well emphasize the dangers inherent in everyday labor, for example. Just how else could we read these images, right? Or indeed capitalist exploitation and lack of public resources, or even pleasure and solidarity men may find in work communities. There are some other images, but to consider these images as evidence of men's disproportionate and unnoticed burden requires us to, willfully forget a more complete picture of the gendered workforce. For example, this picture of male labor markets ignores the risk or danger or alienation or exhaustion that is just as applicable to the Indian female labor force, for example. They work in construction, they work in mines, they work in agriculture, etc. So the exhibit faces an argument about forces, an argument about gender rather than labor. Similarly, boys' portraits demonstrate both contrasts, I don't have any, and continuities to men in juxtaposing depictions of joy and responsibility, right? Here too, this too requires a willful forgetting of the statistics on relative resource distribution and health, and health outcomes for Indian girls. So the affective capital collected for boys largely accrues to MRAs, fostering a claim of lifelong neglect and invisibility. So I won't go into my long discussion of fatherhood and its images or their use of statistics, but just to kind of wrap up this idea and then tell you one more thing. These images from Superman to the sari rally, to the load carrier, to the boy vendor, aptly illustrate the concept of hybrid masculinity, Dimitriou's idea that the ways in which the styles of marginalized and subordinated groups are appropriated with those with more power, ultimately reproducing patriarchal privilege in their favor. We can look at the MRM signature conflation of two categories of men's vulnerability, right? Inequalities of resources and health, and legal outcomes in divorce and custody cases. The bulk of the MRM consists of men who may lose custody or pay large alimony settlements or complaints of unfairness, but the latter category, inequalities of resources and health, doesn't pertain to many of these people, right? MRA leaders are mostly economically privileged, not all. They're mostly middle class and upper caste. They are situated differently than the men you see in these images. These men, ones you see in the images, do lead precarious socioeconomic lives in a highly neoliberal state with ever weaker social support systems, right? But feminist calls for legal reform have not wrought the plight of these, have not wrought this precarity. Myungji will have something to say about that. And so these representations might be understood. So Bush et al., I think the sociologists use this phrase, the appropriation of discursive capital, right, from this group to the next. So in closing, let me return briefly to the MRM exhibition to ask, well, what is so insidious about highlighting men's abjection? By widening the angle to look at a final set of images at the exhibition where grievances with women in law are expressed in overtly misogynist images. So I think you can go to the next one. This is a common trope, right? This slinky, scantily clad woman who has grabbed the wallet of a denuded man. Here's a tie on. Next one. Another shows a woman with a wagging finger, like, do as I say, or your murder will be published as woman stabbed rapist in self-defense. And then I will end with one of my so-called favorite images in this genre. And it often shows up in social media posts. There's a lot going on in that image. My notes took a while to explain. So here is the following ghastly image of death of the innocent man eaten alive by pests. The pictured leeches and mosquitoes represent not just women, but the state, women's NGOs, lawyers, and police. They are imagined to act according to their innate nature, that word again, with the duty of blood extraction. So mangina is a recent popular word among these folks, representing pro-feminist men. The theme of bloodsucking is carried over in those inserts of the feminist blood bank filled by forcible extraction from husbands, these sexy she-devils and this exotic vampire lesbian scenario of injecting, penetrating another woman with this gory essence, right? So, that is like over the top misogyny over there. So there is, of course, an anemic, desanguinated, broken man in the central frame of such pictures, but the tone of this meme is overtly hostile in contrast to the mournful tone of the other images you saw before. So I want to argue for this set of images that the juxtaposition of these two tones in the space of the exhibition reveals the fundamental politics of the Indian MRM. Strategic emasculation and vulnerability designed to draw sympathy directed to a broader public, including the media on the one hand, and the ready use of a misogynist playbook directed to others in the MRM sphere on the other. The spotlight falls on gender roles and structural precarity as harm to men while denying women that effect, or seeing them rather as liberated wanton agents of destruction. In straddling these discourses, the MRM's call to transform masculinity does not involve a change in patriarchal relations or a little change in patriarchal relations, but rather hopes to draw the affect and the resources all to itself. Thank you.
And we'll be turning to Benjamin Moffitt, right? Okay. Benjamin Moffitt is an associate professor of politics and at the Australian Research Council fellow at the National School of Arts at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. His research is located at the intersection of comparative politics, contemporary political theory, and political communications, and focuses on contemporary populism across the globe. He received his PhD from the University of Sydney in 2014 and was a visiting researcher at the Berlin Social Science Center and the University of Toronto. He's also an associate of the Sydney Democracy Network and Uppsala University's Department of Government. Benjamin is the author of 3 books on populism, including The Global Rise of Populism, Performance, Political Style, and Representation, published by Stanford University Press in 2016. He's the co-editor of Populism in Global Perspective, a performative and discursive approach, published with Routledge last year, and he's authored numerous articles in political studies and government and opposition, and in collections such as the Oxford Handbook of Populism. The title of his presentation is Illiberalism, the populist radical rights weaponization of liberalism on gender and LGBTQ+ issues.
Thanks so much for having me. Let me just get up my presentation here. Share screen. All right. We've got that up. Beautiful. All right. So thanks very much for having me here. Thank you, Misha and Roy, for their organisation. As I said, I'm calling in from Melbourne. I'm sorry I can't be there. I've got 2 small children at home and another one on the way, so a bit too far to go. But given I'm calling in from Melbourne, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, you don't need me to tell you that the populist radical right has a tendency to promote anti-gender policies and target women. This conference is taking place in the US, taking place in Chicago. You know very well that a populist radical right leader, a populist radical right party can use the court to, deleteriously affect the lives of women in a very serious way. You don't need me to tell you that the populist radical right also tends to target the LGBTQ+ community. Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, to name a few. You know this stuff. You're at least probably familiar with it. We're at a conference about anti-gender politics worldwide. So what I want to talk about today is something that's a little bit different. It's the way that some populist radical right figures in Western Europe and the Anglosphere have actually sought to present themselves as allies and defenders of women and the LGBTQ+ community. It's what I call a form of liberalism. That is the reconfiguring of liberal tropes for illiberal purposes. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, I want to talk about who the populist radical right are. I want to talk about why populism and liberalism being put together is a kind of weird puzzle. I'll talk about how they've spoken about LGBTQ rights, how they've spoken about gender, and then, talk about liberalism, why they do it, and the ramifications of it. So first things first, who are the populist radical right? Populist radical right is a party family. It's a concept developed by the Dutch political scientist, Cas Mudde. And he says that these parties and the associated politicians with them, movements as well, have 3 main ideological features. The first is nativism, which is an ideology which holds that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, the nation, and that non-native elements, both persons and ideas, are fundamentally threatening to the homogenous nation state. So nativism is essentially nationalism combined with xenophobia. They also have an ideological feature of authoritarianism. When I say that, I'm not talking about a regime type. We talk about authoritarian regimes, but rather an ideological belief that society should be strictly ordered, in which infringements of authority are to be punished severely. And the third feature is populism, which he says is a thin ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogenous and antagonistic groups, the people versus the elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the voulant général, the general will. Now, that definition unites now a really wide range of parties and leaders across the globe. So yes, there's the Western Europe examples, the Front National, National Rally, Le Pen in France, the Freedom Party in Austria, Sweden Democrats, which we've heard a lot about in the news in recent weeks, Donald Trump, of course, and now I think it's fair to say the GOP has made a full turn into being a populist radical right party. But also elsewhere in the world, Modi and the BJP in India, Jair Bolsonaro, Erdogan and the AKP in Turkey, and Cast and the Republican Party in Chile, amongst others across the world. So as this party family has spread and done better electorally as it's gone along, there's been a fair bit of diversity in the ideological features outside of these three that I've referred to here. So for example, on economics, across these parties and leaders, there's actually a fair bit of diversity. Some are hardcore neoliberals or almost borderline libertarian in their economic views, while others are big state welfare chauvinists. For our purposes today, there's also a fair bit of diversity in how they treat gender and LGBTQ rights. So whilst we know, the likes of Trump and Orban are just explicitly against these groups and make no bones about it, what I'm interested in today and speaking about is those parties that are a bit different, that at least attempt to appear that they're interested in these issues. Now, why is this interesting? Who cares if they kind of use kind of liberal defenses again of these groups? Well, the issue here is that populism in the academic literature, and I think more widely, is often presented as antithetical to liberalism. There's a lot of debate about, is populism good for democracy? Is it bad for democracy? But there's not much debate about the question of whether it's bad for liberal and whether it's against liberalism. Takis Pappas says it lines up, it goes against populism goes against liberalism in three main ways. The first is that liberalism celebrates multiple cleavages in society versus that single cleavage of the people versus the elite. Liberalism has an overlapping sense of consensus about how it kind of muddles through versus the adversarial politics of populism. And liberalism adopts constitutionalism versus the majoritarianism in terms of how it sees democracy in the case of populism. So I'm interested in these cases that are kind of mixed bags that kind of fall in between here and how to make sense of them. So let's talk about some of these examples. I'll start with how some of the populist radical right groups and parties that I'm talking about have adopted and spoken about LGBTQ plus issues. The trailblazer here really is Pim Fortuyn, the fellow on the left here, a Dutch politician who was an outspoken, openly homosexual sociology professor who combined what we kind of now see as hallmarks of the Western European populist radical right, anti-Islam, anti-migration, Eurosceptic platform, with a strongly social liberal position on issues around gender, sexuality, and also drug legalization and euthanasia amongst them. And he was able to do this by claiming that these hard-fought liberal rights and permissiveness of Dutch culture were going to be reversed if further immigration took place. This immigration brought about by the multicultural elite, and particularly if they continue from Muslim majority countries. But he was able to defect claims of racism or xenophobia brought against him by proclaiming, and I quote, "I have nothing against Moroccans. I've been to bed with so many of them." Now, this kind of legacy has been continued in the Netherlands. Party for Freedom leader Geert Wilders, the fellow with the blonde hair here, has also been keen to paint himself as an ally of the LGBT community. arguing that he is fighting, and I quote, for the freedom that gay people should have to kiss each other, to marry, to have children, which is exactly what Islam is fighting against, he says. And he even spoke at the Wake Up LGBT Republican National Convention in 2016 alongside Milo Yiannopoulos, which was a strange event where the Republican Party was attempting to show that Trump was allegedly an ally of these groups. He's standing next there with Terry Baudet, the leader and founder of the Forum for Democracy, who's also spoken out against homophobia, but claimed homophobia is, quote, caused by uncontrolled immigration and open borders. There's a theme here, as you can see. Other parties have done it in Europe recently. Marine Le Pen in her 2017 presidential campaign. Her leader, her deputy leader was Florian Philippot, openly gay man, and they together reached out to the gay community and said they would protect them against, again, Muslims. And the Danish Folk Party, the People's Party, who have got their logo there, they've also in their policy documents explicitly targeted Islam as an enemy of LGBT community, claiming that they encourage the police to, quote, take targeted action against specific groups that may exhibit despicable intolerance against homosexuals. So that's the question around some examples around sexuality. What about gender? Well, a number of these parties have also presented themselves as liberal defenders of gender equality, setting up a binary between their so-called enlightened values and the apparent sexism and misogyny of immigrants. These defences have generally developed along three main lines. The first is the need to defend the relatively high levels of gender equality in their countries from the threat raised by the alleged influx of immigrants whose presence would supposedly dilute or threaten the liberal status quo. As Wilders put it, the process of Islamization, he says, in the Netherlands, flushes decades of women's emancipation down the toilet. The second line that they used is the need to protect native-born women from the supposedly misogynistic practices of immigrants. So, for example, the Sweden Democrats, pictured here, their leader, Jimmie Åkesson, in 2010 released a report entitled "It's Time to Speak Out About Rape," in which it was claimed that Sweden was undergoing what they called a rape wave that was due to high levels of immigrants allowed into the country, and therefore their key platform as a key way to reduce sexual assault was to limit immigration. The third line is the attempt to target misogynistic cultural practices in immigrant communities, thus freeing immigrant women from their so-called cultural prisons. So the Norwegian Freedom Party proposed a ban, for example, on the burkini, on the grounds that Norwegians should not, quote, tolerate that girls of such a young age are systematically indoctrinated to accept that women are subordinate and can be suppressed as animals, as adults, sorry. UKIP put out in 2015 a series of measures called Believing in Britain, Believing in Britain's Women. Some of the policies actually looked okay. Repeal of tax on tampons, better and more affordable childcare, but then of course the usual stuff, targeting immigrants in terms of anti-female gender mutilation, anti-honor killings, anti-forced marriages, anything any kind of decent party would stand for, but again, always targeting immigrants as the issue here. So bringing these together, what I think is going on here, and it kind of goes on well from the previous presentation, is there's an adoption of certain tropes from places that you wouldn't necessarily think of. I mean, this is what I call liberal illiberalism. It's the reconfiguring of liberal tropes for illiberal purposes. Now, why on earth do these parties even bother doing this? Well, the first is that the cultural and linguistic and ideological context that some of these parties are operating within, they're not vacuums. Particularly countries of Northern Europe, but also some elsewhere, are celebrated for their pluralism, liberal social values, and progressiveness. And thus, it's unsurprising that parties will pull from these resources that are familiar and available to them in that context, even if their values are not, in line with these baseline national values, it's strategically wise for them to at least pay lip service with them, to them. And they've had to learn to be a bit smarter in that regard. A second reason is it presents them with a so-called, honorable and rational way to frame their Islamophobia and xenophobia. It's much easier to claim, we're defending people, we're standing for Enlightenment values, we're all about gender equality, we need to defend sexual minorities, than to just say we hate Islam, we hate immigrants. And this is part of that shift from an ethnocratic nationalism that used to kind of be so common to a more a civic nationalism, which kind of hides that on ideas around shared values and the like. What are the repercussions of this liberalism of the populist radical right? Well, the first is it, I think, contributes to the debasement and emptying of liberal tropes and arguments. As long as they keep getting away with utilizing some of these, it makes it in turn harder for those who clearly subscribe to liberal ideology to defend their position, because it can gradually lose its credibility. The other central repercussion here is it helps in the mainstreaming and acceptability of the populist radical right. I mean, these parties were once upon a time treated as kind of outsider parties. They're no longer quite there. And part of that has been them learning to utilize the language of the mainstream. But at the same time, mainstream parties then utilizing that language that's been mirrored back to them. There's been a convergence somewhat in the middle between mainstream parties and populist parties. And I think that liberal language has been a useful tool for some of these parties in these particular contexts. So I'll sum up by just saying, what's interesting here for these kind of parties and how they talk about gender and sexuality is that it's clear they're not just populism is not just the opposite of liberalism. Populists openly borrow, ape, utilize the language, if not the policies of liberalism at times, and it's increasingly the case it goes the other way as well, as I mentioned. If populism and liberalism were truly opposites, it would follow that this would either be impossible or extremely difficult to do, but that's obviously not what's going on here. The second is to say that the populist radical right is not a homogenous bloc when it comes to these issues. Not everyone is Donald Trump in this party family, in this group of leaders and movements. And as a result, there's not a one-size-fits-all strategy, I think, for working against what the populist radical right is doing when it comes to gender and sexuality. As such, I think this more nuanced sense of this, what I call liberalism, we need to be very aware of what's going on here. It's a lot more tricky than what the likes of Trump and Orban are doing, and I think it's only going to develop in a more sophisticated way. And being aware of that and watching it and pushing back against it is very important. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm very happy to introduce our last speaker for this panel. Myungji Yang is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. She holds a doctorate in sociology from Brown University. Before joining the sociology department, she served as a visiting fellow at the University of Southern California Korean Studies Institute, MAXPO, and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences. Her research interests and past teaching include political sociology, the sociology of development, social inequality, social movements, and East Asia. Her research has appeared in the journals Politics and Society, Mobilization and International Inquiry, Urban Studies, and Sociological Inquiry, among others. She is the author of From Miracle to Mirage, published through Cornell University Press in 2018. And the paper she will be presenting today is titled Angry Young Korean Men, Anti-Feminist Politics in an Age of Polarization.
Thank you for a nice introduction, and thank you for staying until the very last presentation today. And thank you, Misha and Roy, for organizing this fascinating event. So I learned a lot today, and I see a lot of parallels and differences between Korean case and other cases. I have been working on right-wing politics for last several years, but this is my first paper that worked on gender. So any kind of feedback would be greatly appreciated. So so in my presentation today, I want to address how anti-feminism gained traction in South Korean politics and how anti-feminist sentiments were mobilized by conservative party and figures. So in general, South Korean elections are determined by the age and the region. So for example, older generation were more likely to support the Conservative Party and candidates, and the Southeast region is the stronghold of right-wing party. But in the last two elections, we see newer pattern that we haven't watched before. So actually you see the gender difference, especially among young generations. So if you look at the left and right graph, you can see that young male voters supported the Conservative Party like by 65% and almost 60% in the recent presidential election. And the opposite was true for young female voters. And if you compare with older generations, you don't see like, gender differences, but you can see the gender differences only among younger generations. So can I, next? So many commentators and mass media started paying attention to this new phenomenon, men in their 20s. So historically, the younger generation, usually like people in their 20s, were the most progressive group in South Korean politics. So usually they supported the most progressive candidates in the election, and then they were always at the forefront of fighting for and leading to social change. But in the recent years, you see these young men who were converted to more like conservative ways. So more than half supported the Conservative Party and its candidates, and then they were less likely to support redistributive and welfare policies. And more interestingly, these young men in their 20s and 30s widely shared anti-feminist sentiment. And also in the most recent presidential election, actually that happened in March this year, this conservative presidential candidate took the anti-feminist stance, especially by promising to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. He successfully won the hearts of young men, and it significantly helped him to win the presidential election. And now you can see his Twitter account saying that, like, abolishing the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. So my questions are, why do young men widely believe that they are the victims of gender inequality and feminism is a female supremacy movement? And why and how did young Korean men come to hold strong anti-feminist opinions? And under what social political conditions has anti-feminism been effective in mobilizing mass support? And what are the broader political implications here? This is especially puzzling and more troubling, given that South Korea is not at all genderly equal society. As you may know, South Korea has the highest gender pay gap in OECD countries, and women's representation in both public and private sectors are extremely low. And women's labor participation rate is slightly above 50%. And in daily life, many of young women are subject to sex violence and harassment, etc. So, despite all these obvious indicators of gender inequality, why do young men suddenly, believe that they are the victims of gender inequality? So my argument is that So this is related to backlash against two different events. So one is the rise of young feminist movement in the recent decades, and it was backlash against the failure of the new liberal reformist government about accomplishing fairness and social justice. And the accumulated sense of young men's fear and anxiety, resentment were translated into anti-feminist sentiment. So that's my argument. And obviously it was mobilized by right-wing politicians. So I want to talk about the rise of young feminist movements in the recent decades. So young feminist movements are distinctive from previous state feminism. So state feminism were mostly led by elite women. They were closely working with the liberal governments and progressive politicians, and they tried to address some like social institution and change more like patriarchal laws. But stark reality to which many young women were subject to gender inequality and sex violence in their daily life made young women realize that this kind of institutionally channeled movement is not enough. So these people, young feminists, try to promote more like internet-based, grassroots-oriented and movement that resort to direct action. So around 2015, some young feminists founded internet website to fight against misogynic male-dominant internet community called Megalia. They, tried to condemn like gender inequality and misogyny in Korean society. But what was very interesting about this website was that the young feminists used the very tactic that were used by this misogynic male community. So, for example, this male community, men would objectify, women's body, etc. But then, this feminist website used the exactly same tactic by revealing that men's body could be objectified. So, in a sense, it was very effective. And then there was this meme that made fun of Korean men's small penis size, etc. So, it was effective to reveal gender inequality, misogyny in Korean society, but at the same time, it was very controversial, aggressive. Also, at the same time, some people increased their sense of hostility toward feminists as well. Also, as you may know, illegal spy cam was thriving in Korean society. So this end room in Telegram, so a lot of men actually circulated illegally filmed women's body images and some like video clips of like sexual trafficking, etc. So it was a criminal case that was found in 2020, but right before then, there were a lot of discussion about this illegal spy cam epidemic in Korean society. So in 2018, many young women were mobilized, and hundreds and thousands of young Korean women took to the street to condemn this spy cam, and then you can see the slogan of "My life is not your phone." So basically, 2010s, there was explosive growth of feminist movements that were a very different type of feminist movement in the past. So it was very effective and successful in gaining public attention about gender inequality, but at the same time, it kind of, increased feeling of being threatened among men. And then they also painted the image of feminism as very like radical and aggressive, and also like negative images. And another relevant factor is that this reformist leftist, liberal, whatever you call it, the new Moon Jae-in government that came in power in 2017 after the massive candlelight rallies that successfully impeached and ousted the corrupt President Park Geun-hye. So by identifying it as the candlelight government, President Moon Jae-in promised to fulfill the social demands of fairness and social justice. So at the beginning, people had really high hopes and expectation about this new government and reform policies, but soon after, people became really disappointed because there were some scandals where these people, progressive people in high cabinet positions were involved in rigged college admission and sexual harassment, etc. So people were disillusioned with so-called progressive politicians that were not that different from conservative, corrupt establishment, and they didn't live up to their progressive value. Also, like this Moon government's housing policies completely failed, and during the 5 years, housing prices went up rapidly. So this resentment about the so-called progressive government was increasing, especially among young generation. And I need to mention the notion of the fairness in Korean society. So maybe last 5-10 years, this notion of fairness has been the key word in Korean society as really important value or principle that have to be met as sort of social justice. So given that the job market is extremely competitive and intense, and the difference between winners and losers were extremely slim in terms of qualifications. So whether the process, a process of recruitment or hiring or selecting somebody was fair or not was extremely important for younger generation, and they were very sensitive to the value of fairness. But the ways in which fairness was understood in Korean society is very interesting. So for example, many people believe that rewards should be given to people who worked hard, who have individual merits, etc. So if people didn't work hard, and didn't own corresponding merits, they don't deserve any kind of rewards, for example. So in that sense, fairness is understood by like meritocracy, but at the same time, this can be a principle that could legitimize social inequality and hierarchy at the same time. So from this perspective, young people are resentful, and they believe that fairness was not really met if they see those who get like special treatment or free riders, if they get a job, they can be really resentful because these people who get unfair special treatment or free riders are considered to have violated the principle of fairness and also meritocratic order. So, feminism is sort of understood from this perspective. So for example, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family have argued the gender quota system in employment. But from men's perspective, this is like, violating meritocratic order or fairness. So, like the enemy or those who should be blamed in terms of fairness and social justice were like feminist groups and the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family in Korean society. So let me show some interesting survey results. So this is a survey for young people, I think between 19 and 34 years old. If you look at women, 75% of women, young women, believe that women are not treated fairly in Korean society. But complete opposite is true for young men. So more than half believe that they are the ones who are not treated fairly, and they are the basically victims. So you can see that very gendered perceptions about gender inequality here. Also, you can see very contrasting perceptions about feminism between men and women. So the first graph shows that like 75, almost 80% of men believe that feminism is a female supremacy movement. And 25, around 30% of men believe that feminism is a legitimate demand. So you can see that they have very hostile, negative perceptions about feminism. So I reconstructed young men's narrative. So if you know Ali Hochschild's book, she's basically describing this deep story widely shared by these Tea Partiers in the American South. So basically, you know, these conservative American, white Americans believe that they were hardworking, waiting in a line patiently, waiting for like the American dream. But then there are all these minorities, immigrants, Black Americans, women, refugees, etc., who cut in a line. So they believe that it's not fair. And then same kind of logic is applied to Korean young men's narrative as well. So they believe that like they didn't get any kind of privilege as men while growing up, but then they are told that like they are the privileged one and women are minorities. So they feel like very unfair about this kind of notion. And then there were some hate crimes against women. And then there were some debates, you know, these mentally ill men stalked young men and then killed a woman, things like that. So like, you know, the police and men would say that like, oh, this was individual case that, you know, mentally ill person killed a woman. But then a lot of women would argue that like this is not just one single case, you know, there is this widespread misogyny, and then, you know, they target only women, etc. So there were a lot of debates, but anyway, so in young men's narrative, they are arguing that like we are not the one who did commit sex crimes, but you know, feminists and young Korean women argue that like, you know, Korean men are the problems. And eventually, you know, as you can see, they believe that they are the one, they are the victims of this unfair system, and they are subjected to reverse discrimination. So in this context, conservative around the election time, conservative politicians and media started mobilizing and capitalizing on this anti-feminist sentiments. So some prominent politicians started attacking the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, and at the same time they painted the liberal Moon Jae-in government as the corrupt, Hippocratic establishment. So you can see that, like, you know, they try to make the point that, like, you know, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family are the ones that exacerbate gender conflict and divide. And then behind the ministry, there are extreme radical feminists. And then basically they try to represent young men's voice by arguing that young men are the victims. They are the ones who are subjected to reverse discriminations. So to conclude, so I want to make a point that like this young man's shared sense of resentment, frustration was translated into anti-feminist sentiments. And then obviously it was in line with conservative political strategy. And in the past, Korean right-wing focused more on anti-communism and anti-North Korea, etc., because of the historical geopolitical conditions of confronting with North Korea. So anti-communism was the most important ideological weapon, but in this new opportunity structure, they try to marketize anti-feminism as their new ideological weapon or resource. And as you can see here, like we see the similar logic between anti-feminist sentiments in Korea and anti-immigration stance in Western Europe or in the US, but immigration population is not yet high in Korean society, and also like anti-immigration is not politicized as important political agenda. So instead, many right-wing people try to scapegoat feminism and so-called radical feminists as their potential enemy and try to represent ordinary young men's voice. So this is, thank you.
And now I would like to introduce our discussant for the panel, Professor Linda Zerilli. She is the Charles E. Merriam Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. She was the 2010 to 2016 Faculty Director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, where she continues in her capacity as a leading scholar and teacher in the field. Zerilli is the author of the monographs Signifying Woman, Culture and Chaos in Rousseau, Burke, and Mill, Feminism in the Abyss of Freedom, and A Democratic Theory of Judgment, and articles on subjects ranging across feminist thought, the politics of language, aesthetics, democratic theory, and continental philosophy. She has been a Fulbright Fellow, a two-time member of the Institute for Advanced Study, and a Stanford Humanities Center Fellow. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. And thank you everyone for still being alive and listening to my comments. These are wonderful papers and I feel privileged to be able to comment on them. These papers really look at political struggles in very different national contexts, so India, South Korea, and Northern Europe. Nevertheless, they share a concern with the ways in which normative gender and anti-normative gender identities and sexualities are mobilized by political movements and radical right-wing parties to generate cultural, social, and political power, or as I shall put it, hegemony. Although hegemony is not the term preferred by any of the authors, I want to introduce it in my comments as a way of making sense of the astonishing and alarming rise of deeply conservative to radical right-wing power and the possibilities of resistance. Hegemony is, as I'm sure you know, a term that derives from Gramsci. To exercise power, a dominant class in a liberal society must be able to form a hegemonic bloc, a composite formation that selectively integrates the interests of different social forces and class fractions. The process is mediated by political and ideological practices so that politics and ideology do not just reflect the economic base, but actively play a role in the social formation. Ernesto Leclos and Stuart Hall took up Gramsci's theory of hegemony in the 1980s to explain the triangular relationship between the rise of Thatcherism, the crisis of the left, and the emergence of the new social movements. Whereas Leclos understood hegemony as an abstract political logic with ontological underpinnings, Hall read Gramscian hegemony as a theory of the political conjuncture. For Hall, to focus on complex social formations is to leave the terrain of abstraction in favor of concrete historical analyses attuned to the complexities of social identities. To explain the rise of Thatcherism, argued Hall, one had to grasp the emerging political conjuncture. Thatcherism succeeded. It became hegemonic because it was simply better at articulating the antagonisms around race, gender, and sexuality politicized by the new social movements. On this basis, it was able to build popular consent to its authoritarian political project. Thatcherism reflected what Gramsci called an organic crisis, a moment when people ceased to trust political leaders and parties, and upstart forces challenged those seeking to conserve the old order. During these periods, contradictions arise that band together disparate groups, and the very idea of what is considered ordinary common sense changes. Against critics, Hall held that Thatcher succeeded not by tricking voters, but rather by constructing a worldview that mapped onto their real lives and problems, if not their class identities, and advancing policies that reflected these concerns. Hall takes this as a reminder that interests are not given, but always have to be politically and ideologically constructed, a lesson worth recalling in our discussion today. Critical of the left's failure in the face of Thatcherism, he blamed the Labour Party for its administrative understanding of politics and its belief that political subjects are one-dimensional actors whose motivation can be reduced to economic interest. The left, he wrote, does not seem to have the slightest idea of what putting together a new historical project entails. It does not understand the necessarily contradictory nature of human subjects, of social identities. It does not understand politics as a production. It does not see that it is possible to connect with the ordinary feelings and experiences which people have in their everyday lives, and yet to articulate them progressively to a more advanced modern form of social consciousness. It does not recognize that the identities which people carry around in their heads, their subjectivities, their cultural life, their sexual life, their family life, and their ethnic identities are always incomplete and have been massively politicized. Hall's writings on the rise of Thatcher's authoritarian populism and the cluelessness of the left are a sober reminder of the costs paid by political actors who neglect the complexities of social identities, and I would argue the key role that gender and sexuality play in any political conjuncture. It is vital that feminists and queer activists not only describe or document anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ movements, but also strive to make sense of the concerns and anxieties that lead ordinary citizens to embrace apocalyptic accounts of what the very idea of gender and non-normative sexualities means for them and their communities. We need to provide a worldview that maps onto citizens' real lives in the ways Hall described. I read these papers as an effort to read through the terrain of ideological struggle over identities in the manner suggested by Hall, though I shall be also suggesting where I think they might go further. Notwithstanding their different national contexts, the papers share a mode of political theorizing that seems essential for making sense of where we are now and what paths of resistance and transformation are possible. Each paper works at the level not of an abstract political logic, but of the political conjuncture. They theorize through historical specificity to arrive at a critical analysis of populism, anti-feminism, anti-LGBTQ politics. Now, let me start with Benjamin Moffitt's paper. Moffitt examines the selective use of liberalism by Northern European populist radical right parties, what he calls illiberal liberalism. The puzzle here is why these parties invoke liberal ideas and tropes, and with what consequences for liberal democracies. The paper rightly refuses a strict binary of populism versus liberalism and compellingly shows their radical entanglement in historically nuanced ways. Moffitt theorizes illiberal liberalism not as a political logic, but as a political conjuncture. He makes a compelling case for how populist radical right parties adopt elements of liberalism, such as women's and LGBTQ rights, all the better to justify and animate, for example, their Islamophobia. I agree that these parties adopt liberal principles for their own ends, but I think Moffitt could do more to show, as Hall did with Thatcherism, how these parties do not simply mimic or take up, but disrupt the given liberal consensus and create a new common sense. Or more precisely, how they take advantage of the real failings of neoliberal regimes to speak to the concerns of citizens and construct a worldview that makes better sense of their lives. By better, I do not mean more accurate. as if their explanation of citizen suffering and grievances were correct, but rather their skill in articulating a picture of how things are that is more attuned to the complexities of citizen identities. Moffitt also makes the important point that such parties can cherry pick which liberal values to espouse, not only because they had to normalize their otherwise extreme positions in the language of the current civic zeitgeist, but also because mainstream liberal parties themselves have moved to the right. I agree that they have so moved, but I wondered whether this story might run the risk of making it appear that liberalism, which had presumably once been good and true to its ideals, had become deformed in the engagement with the radical right. My point is this: the risk is that the critics of illiberal liberalism, like Moffitt, can be driven into a more idealized account of liberalism than the historical record, which includes, after all, colonialism, slavery, and unequal integration, warrants. You say, Moffitt says, for example, I thought you were going to be here anyway, that these right populist parties should not be called liberal or even liberal populist because they are nativist or nationalist, and their conception of the people tends to exclude rather than include. I agree. But if one understands liberalism not as an abstract set of ideas, let alone a political logic, but as a diverse set of historical practices, then surely liberalism too has tended to exclude rather than include. Nativism is not an alien tradition, but inherent in the racialized and gendered historical realities of the present liberal political order. As Michael Rogan once argued in an exchange with Roger Smith, to treat nativism as a separate tradition in the American context is to treat liberalism as an abstract set of ideas rather than historical practices. I fear we could make the same mistake here with radical right populism. I would encourage Moffitt then to look not only at the ways in which liberalism itself has moved to the right, but to the historical practices of exclusion that give this shift a material basis and a history. There are and always have been real tensions within the liberal tradition about who and who does not belong, as I'm sure he is aware. A related point, although the appropriation of liberalism by right-wing populism may well make it hard to defend liberalism, I'm not sure I would say, as he does, that it empties liberal tropes and arguments of their meaning. Can't we think about the vulnerability of those tropes to the actual historical practice of liberal forms of exclusion and a suspect universalism? So once again, I wanted Moffitt to be somewhat more critical of liberalism. I guess my point must be clear by now. Rather than deformed by populism, hasn't liberalism itself generated all sorts of self-deformations of its espoused ideals whenever they were claimed by people who were not initially intended as their primary subjects? And finally, I want to hear a bit more about how Moffitt thinks of the problem of a kind of democratic deficit at the heart of liberal democracy, or let's call it neoliberal democracy. That would take me in a whole other direction, which I'll be getting to in just a moment. But, you know, the paper is really about liberalism, but shouldn't it really be about neoliberalism, or to what extent would making it about neoliberalism sort of alter, you know, the picture of liberalism that we have in the paper? Okay, I'm just going to move on here. So moving now to Professor Basu's fascinating paper. Professor Basu takes us through the complex semiotics of mustaches in the context of the men's rights movement in India, among other things. This basic puzzle here is why men's rights activists should create a common identity in their alleged status as victims. The core irony at the heart of the movement is that men, as a historical and social group, still have tremendous privileges in India vis-a-vis women, and yet they cultivate what Basu calls a strategic disempowerment that only works to rescue their power. How can this identification with suffering be explained? That's the question that she's asking in the paper, and it's a very important question. Here I was wondering whether you have or might consider Wendy Brown's well-known argument about liberalism and what she called wounded attachments. In Brown's view, individuals can develop a wounded attachment to their identity as victims, wishing to overcome it, but unable to conceive of themselves in other terms. Brown's focus was mostly on politicized identities, such as we associate with the new social movements, people and groups who have been historically disenfranchised and excluded from the promises of liberal equality. But she also suggests that such attachments become a kind of grammar for modern political rights and rights claims. In other words, a group such as men might feel that it had to present itself as a wounded subject because being victimized is a condition of a claim to rights in the contemporary context. Brown writes, liberalism contains from its inception a generalized incitement to what Nietzsche terms ressentiment, the moralizing revenge of the powerless, the triumph of the weak as the weak. This incitement to ressentiment inheres in two related constitutive paradoxes of liberalism. There is a paradox between individual liberty and social egalitarianism, which produces failure turned to recrimination by the subordinated and guilt turned to resentment by the successful, unquote. The men's rights activists you describe seem to be beset by the latter and seek to occupy the position of the former in performance, but not in fact. The question, though, is whether this affective attachment to suffering, which is staged at the level of performance and may well, if Brown is correct, be the condition of making rights claims, might not leak, for lack of a better word here, into the subject, that is, become a kind of attachment that cannot be so easily discarded once one has attained one's political end. On another, so in other words, there's a form of subjectification here, right? Yeah. I mean, and not to, yeah. On another point, Professor Banshu shows how gender difference, so articulated, becomes an antagonism that conceals other social antagonisms, such as those of caste and class. The exhibit put on by the men's rights movement, for example, might have shown the dangers, as she argued today, inherent in everyday labor or indeed capitalist exploitation, but instead forces an argument about gender rather than labor. Here, I think we see how social antagonisms get articulated in just the way that Hall described when he tried to explain the lesson of Gramsci for making sense of Thatcherism. It successfully constructs women and women's rights as the enemy, and thereby occludes not only the workings of neoliberal capitalism on men's well-being, but the significant differences among men on matters of access to the resources that protect some from its ravaging effects. This brings me to Professor Young's excellent paper. The argument tries to make sense of why young Korean men come to hold strong anti-feminist positions and to be supporters of the radical right and anti-gender politics. Like Professor Basu, Professor Young tries to make sense of men's resentment vis-a-vis women in a society where men still have extraordinary power. What is distinctive about the South Korean case, she argues, is the extent to which anti-feminist attitudes have been mainstreamed. Once the expression of alienated young men on male-dominated internet forums, misogynistic and anti-feminist ideas are now embedded in party platforms and the promises that conservative politicians such as Yoon Suk Lee made to young male voters. Professor Yang traces much of this back to the failures of the Moon administration and neoliberal structuring since 1997. The question, of course, is how was it possible to make women and gender equality policies the scapegoats for the ravages of neoliberal capitalism? Here, I wanted you to say a bit more about how the concept of fairness could become gender coded in a way that was antithetical to its original gender coding, where women were the ones who were not treated fairly. This could involve a closer analysis of how fairness, which got defined as what one has the right to based on individual merit, came to be espoused as part of neoliberal ideology. We know that neoliberalism has to do with dismantling the social state, deregulation, privatization, regressive taxation, and suspicion of public goods in favor of entrepreneurial privatized endeavors. And we often think of populisms and right-wing regimes as more or less anti-neoliberal. But as popular mobilizations, they are often very much born from neoliberal rationality. They are authoritarian politically and libertarian civically and personally. So this concept of fairness, in other words, is a kind of parasitic on that, I suppose I want to say. What this means is that there can be political forms of what Hall called authoritarian liberalism, which is for many people a contradiction in terms. Yet I think we need to see them as a form of anti-democratic liberalism that prizes individual liberties and rights almost without bounds. This is a libertarian heritage of neoliberalism. That's why I was skeptical of Benjamin Moffitt's attempt to retain an idea of liberalism that would be untouched by neoliberal libertarianism that lends itself to authoritarian liberalism. The question here would be to think through how it is that the neoliberal project can be actualized through the articulation of specific antagonisms, such as that of gender, and second, how this antagonism itself undermines the struggle for democracy. Finally, how have these developments led Korean feminists to remain attached to the problem, or have they? I guess it's more of a question. Have they led Korean feminists to remain attached to problems of identity and subjectivity as developed in second and third wave feminism? How does it undercut the possibilities of feminism as a democratic movement when identity politics gets narrowly interpreted and is a struggle for women's rights only? I have some concluding remarks, but I went on for too long, so I'll just stop there. Thanks so much.
Okay, so shall we open the floor to the panelists to respond to Professor Zerilli's comments?
Should I do something? Sorry, I got here. Should I do something to turn on the mic? It's on. Yeah. Hi. I think you cracked it, actually. I fully agree about the hegemony, and I haven't read Wendy Brown's Wounded Attachment, but that seems exactly what you're going for. But the thing that I just wanted to add there is that there is, I think, an essential contrast, right, between Myungji's and my groups of men with similar purpose. Those of you who have moved here from South Asia more recently than me can tell me what you think, which is that they are not that powerful. You know, in yours, like it's a successful power grab, sort of, right? Here they have, in fact, like they are less powerful, I would say. I mean, they've made some legislative interventions, you know, you can see about them really in the paper, but I have a lot to say about that Twitter storm, which was a big giant failure. They went on a marriage strike, which nobody struck. But, you know, so I think that's interesting, right? That it is both those, but it's still a hegemonic attempt, right, to whatever thing. Should I?
Oh, yeah, no, thank you for very sharp comments. I absolutely agree with the notion of neoliberalism. Actually, I forgot to mention neoliberal project in my presentation, but yeah, if you look at what they use as discourse, you know, they are like deeply internalizing the notion of neoliberalism, like fair competition and merits, etc. So like, you know, I need to work on theorizing those things, but I absolutely agree that neoliberalism strongly works in the Korean case.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Linda. I totally also agree with what you are saying. And so 2 quick points. The first point that you made about the issue of critics of populism falling into a kind of romantic or unfettered idea of, you know, a pure liberalism is totally correct. And I think it's a really strong tendency on the literature, not only the literature on populism, but kind of the popular literature and media that academics often appear on speaking about populism. So we get these kind of defenses from people like Yasha Monk, you know, people who identify as hardcore liberals. The only nuanced, like, liberal approach I think I've seen about populism really comes from Jan Werner Müller, who thinks deeply on these things. In terms of the democratic deficit, and how you go about, creating these collective identities in that space. I think the other issue with this whole literature is that there's kind of the liberal side, which is totally against populism and wants to defend liberalism without engaging necessarily with those kind of issues that you are totally correct to point out. Or on the other hand, the kind of radical democratic approach that Moof's now taken up, following on hers and Leclerc's work, where populism is politics, is hegemony, and is the way to construct the people. And it seems to me that they both, that binary has kind of come to a dead end. The space somewhere between doesn't seem to have been found out. And that's why we're still kind of dealing, I think, with the problem of particularly the populist radical right. Thanks so much.
So we have about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, if there are questions in the audience. Okay, maybe we'll start with you.
Thank you, Dr.
Hang on, someone do.
Thanks to everyone for their talks, but I just have two questions specifically for Srimati, actually. Your talk reminded me actually of this Vogue India ad that came out many years ago, which was specifically actually about talking about how gender roles harm boys, specifically this series of boys who are crying and being told literally boys don't cry. And that ad went viral, but it partly went viral because Indian men were very upset that the how gender roles harm men was being used to talk about men's violence and not men's vulnerability. And the latter is what you're sort of getting at in your presentation. So this also begs the question, because gender roles do harm men, but I wonder if part of sort of the men you talk to, them recognizing that gender roles harm them, allows them to think about how gender roles harm women, or if gender roles are something that's even connected to patriarchy, for example. So that's one question. The second question is, you talked at the you alluded at the very end of your talk that most of your respondents, or rather most of the leaders of the men's rights movements, are upper caste or middle, and generally from a class perspective, they're middle class. We talk so much about the intersection of gender and caste with respect to women. I wonder if we can talk about that intersection with respect to men, and if any of your respondents were Dalit or lower caste men, and how they situate next to this movement. So that's all.
Are you collecting, or shall I answer?
Why don't you answer? Yeah.
Hi. I would love to see the ad if you can find it. But the thing you said reminded me that Gillette, the razor company, actually ran this ad about 3-4 years ago, right? Similarly about this new kind of man, and there was so much protest against it from men's groups, among others, right? To say that. So, wait, I'll ask you. Tell me what you asked. If it was a. Yeah. Yeah, I remember now. So this is, Michael Messner, who's a sociologist. He makes this point, Kimmel makes this point in some ways, and it's very, very prominent in the Indian men's movement. They're totally, absolutely connected to patriarchy, but in that story, they are the victims of patriarchy. Right. So that's why I was saying, they're like, oh yes, we are the real victims. Right? Look at that lovely girl. Look how free she has to be. So Messner says that in the US men's movement, for example, that was a big kind of theme, gender roles as the harm. So all these men who were part of the men's caucus of the National Organization for Women, then actually some of them became famous anti-feminists. So it's kind of a cross-cultural theme, actually. And second, I didn't, I have to figure out caste from people's iterations of it. So I don't have a real answer to that, but I can tell you that in going to meetings, there were very obviously lots of poorer men, lots of abject men. And I was I've written about elsewhere, I was really kind of impressed with the kindness with which they were treated, how they became part of these much more middle-class homes. So there is a kind of like, you know, community building that's kind of real. Yeah.
Hello. My question is for Dr. Moffitt, and it was actually really a challenge for me to follow the argument because I'm also a political scientist working on the anti-gender movements, especially in Europe. And what I was confused about, and I think Dr. Zerilli mentioned this as well, is when I looked through all those populist governments, what I found was that they're actually neoliberal in their core, usually, like most of them. What I mean is that there is, as we know, in terms of neoliberalism, there's reduction in welfare state measures, there's privatization, like in terms of women's and gender policies, they abandon parental leaves, childcare policies, they put all those burdens on women because they actually argue that traditional family requires women to take these jobs basically. So I'm sort of confused on the fact that like also even in, not only in terms of Europe, but I think Dr. Borba and Dr. Feldman mentioned this, also even like populist leaders like Bolsonaro privatize everything and they leave the welfare state measures. So yeah, I'm sort of confused on this. Are you taking liberalism as liberal thought, like political thought? That makes sense. But if it's in terms of practical political measures, in terms of the political spectrum, these parties are actually right-wing, and liberalism is a right-wing political ideology, at least in terms of the European sense. But if we're being like Anglo-Saxon politically, then that might mean it's liberalism might be sort of like in the middle or left. But if we look, especially in terms of the European Union, I would argue that liberal parties themselves are in the right wing, positioned in terms of the political spectrum. So yeah, I was sort of confused. If you could clarify it. Thank you.
Yeah. So in the paper I talk about, so the confluence of like liberal and the left is even in the English speaking world, that's American. That's an American like thing. And so that's not what I'm talking about there. I'm talking about, I use Michael Frieden's definition. I'm talking about in an ideological sense, an ideology that has 7 political concepts at its core: liberty, rationality, individuality, progress, sociability, the general interest, and limited and accountable power. Now, in terms of, so a lot of those parties are on the right that I speak about, 100%, I agree with that. But to say that they're all neoliberal parties, I don't think is correct. It's particularly in like the Scandinavian context, where a lot of them are actually welfare chauvinists, whereby they're actually, you know, in favor of a strong welfare state, but it's only for the native people. They want to have hardcore protection, but only for the native people. And it's seen that immigrants are coming to the country and diluting those benefits as well. So that's one part of that aspect. But as I said, at the same time, there are a number of I'm talking about a subset of populist radical right parties here. As I said, they're the mixed bag. You're absolutely correct to say that there's other parties that are very much neoliberal in their economic policies and combine that with very traditional notions, you know, basically women back in the home to look after the kids, the state should provide for that. So if I didn't make that clear, I'm sorry, this is a real particular subset of some, what I said were mixed bag cases. But I think what you're speaking about is a far more common situation amongst these parties.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing here. I mean, I really do think that this is, you know, there is always this question of like, well, what's the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism, right? I mean, some people say that neoliberalism is a sort of logical outcome of liberalism. Others say, oh no, there's a big difference between liberalism and neoliberalism. I'm not going to try to get into that debate right now. But what I do think is very important, and this is what I was trying to say in my comments, is that we are understandably terrified by the rise of this radical new right, by these radical populist parties. And the danger is to kind of circle the wagons as far as liberalism goes. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, let's just hang on to what we had there. And believe me, I've been in so many conversations with people about this, I mean, people are like, wait a minute, I thought you were critical. And it's sort of, yeah, but given what the alternative is, we got to go back to, and that's what I mean by circle the wagons. And so I think you have to do a lot of, I don't call it soul searching. It's not soul searching, but really looking at critically, the history of the development of liberalism and neoliberalism and how these ideas, for example, of nativism, just have always inhered in these, not just these I mean, the idea that you can separate out the ideology, the ideas from the practice is, I think we go wrong when we try to do that. I mean, I understand why we might try to do that, but I think it's a mistake. So it's sort of a look in the mirror kind of thing. And the idea of just, projecting it all onto these populist, radical right populist parties that are destroying our, that's crazy. And then the one other point, which I sort of made, but I really do want to make more strongly, is that I think it's very important for those of us who study this sort of thing, not to, it's easy to adopt a stance of sort of, mockery and just, sort of describing the absurdity of some of these groups. I mean, it's hard to listen to Professor Bansu's paper and see the mustaches and just be not, it's like hilarious in some way. But you have to be trying to make sense. And this is why I still think that someone like Stuart Hall is such an important person to go back to and read in terms of the rise of Thatcherism and how a lot of people just got it wrong because they refused to actually admit that that Thatcher was putting together a world picture that made sense for them. It made sense to people. It took account of their desires, their fantasies, their et cetera. And it's not a matter of it being, that's what I said, it's not a matter of it being correct, like, she's right in telling them their grievances really are, whatever, all the things she said, but rather she was able to pull it together in such a way that, whereas the left kept insisting on, economic goods or whatever it may be. And you see the same thing today. So I think that, we need to catalog all this stuff. There's no question about it. And this conference has been amazing in sense of just giving, so much information. It's like terrifying information, but we also need to be figuring out, okay, what are they doing? Like, how are they articulating these social antagonisms in such a way, which do exist, An absolute final point is, what is our condition today? It's one of what Hannah Arendt talked about as worldlessness, superfluousness, and, homelessness. And it's like people are unhinged. And I think that unless we start there and try to understand those real anxieties, and then why it is that gender and sexuality become the way of suturing, these identities, that we're just, we might feel good about ourselves, we're superior in terms of our views, but we're not going to win politically. Sorry, that went on a little longer.
True.
Hi, my question is to Professor Basu. So thank you for that talk and for those extraordinary images. My question is, how do you sort of situate your project within the history of colonialism and the British's construction of Indian men as being effeminate or vulnerable or weak? And how do you sort of situate that? Are Indian men currently laying claim to a sort of hegemonic masculinity that they were deprived of during the colonial period?
Could I suggest now that if there are other questions, we bundle them and then have that? Maybe there aren't more.
It's 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
Glass of wine.
Did you have one that you want to tack on? Yeah, let's bundle and then we'll
we're bundling.
the evening and the section.
I guess this could be probably sort of for either of you, because one of the things that you both mentioned was sort of, you know, at the beginning of some of these sort of men's rights movements, as it were, this kind of backlash was something where there's some, you know, kernel of legitimacy, something that begins that conversation, right? And then it gets overtaken and becomes something so ridiculous where, you know, men who are making twice as much as women feel like they're being victimized. So I think one of my questions is, how do, you know, within asking these questions or looking into this, what is the sort of entryway to be able to come back and sort of almost like legitimize the initial questions that start some of these movements that have become kind of ridiculous?
That actually goes nicely with something I want to say. You can answer as well. So Malvika, thank you for mentioning that. That was a paragraph I took out of this, my 10 pages. So I've been looking at Mrinalini Sinha's work, of course, on colonial masculinity, right? And how, so in her argument, this idea of the, you know, the manly Englishman and the effeminate Bengali, I think that's her phrase, but how that the Bengali man's complaint of the effeminate Bengali also allowed him a certain kind of hegemonic dominance, right? So I've been thinking about that in this context, you know, so there's no articulation by these folks of colonialism, you know, they are very like, we are here in the post-colonial Indian state, right? They own it. You know, nobody's thinking back on colonialism. And other than, there is a lot of, Camille, there is a lot of sort of the UN groups as a conspiracy to seize global capital type of language, right? There's some mentions of CEDAW and etc., right? So colonialism in that sense, you know, the neocolonialism, we'll say, but nothing like that. But I'll just briefly answer Michael, right? Yeah. So I think the manifest reason for this is that this combination of criminal law and civil law being used in divorce cases, and I do think that a better feminist conversation can be had about on the one hand, on sort of carceral solutions to family law, but on the other hand, many of these men's great resistance to even paying anything, right? So I do want to have a better conversation among feminists, even to how what that anxiety is. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't quite understand your question. Can you repeat your?
Just kind of curious. There's something there's almost a legitimate claim at the beginning.
Yeah, of men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was
it? Become ultimately illegitimate as a moral structure. So my question was, how do you work with them or address some of the questions that will likely be?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, that's really a question to answer. Obviously, you know, this young generation are very precarious people. I mean, compared with previous generation, their parents' generation, you know, there are absolute lack of decent economic opportunities. So this sense of fear, anxiety is really widespread, regardless of men and women, right? So it's not about like gender perception, like all of them have this anxiety about their uncertain futures. But I think, you know, that obviously the target is totally wrong, you know, but they believe that like women are their potential competitors. And then also, you know, in Korea, men have to serve 2 years of military service, whereas women do not. So this can be extremely a sensitive issue. Also, you know, I think there is particular thing here. So the reason that young men have a strong anti-feminist stance is that, like in their young age, they didn't experience their lives yet, right? So like once you get a job and then have a family later, they see that women are suffering. But at that age, women can be seen as just their competitors. So, you know, if you look at like older men, you know, I'm not saying they are more feminist, but, you know, in a sense, they are more sympathetic to feminism. So I think there is something to do with their own like life course. So I don't know, maybe like, it's in some senses, feminism was considered as very like contaminated language. Like if you ask young men, like, oh, are you agreeing that like, men and women equally share the house chore burden, etc.? They would say yes, highly yes compared with other generations. So I think there is some like interesting thing here we can analyze. I mean, I didn't go to that far yet, but somehow like, I don't know, maybe in school, like we have to educate young children about feminism and its like legitimacy, etc. Then like maybe the picture may look different in the future, but I don't have really specific answers.
Well, thank you so much.
It's just really super clear.